The courtroom was breathless, holding still as 5-year-old Lila Thompson stepped through the tall wooden doors, her tiny fingers wrapped tightly around the leash of Scout, a German shepherd whose scarred flank told stories of his own. Every eye followed her as she crossed the room, small and silent, but steady. She was the only witness to what should have never happened. And yet, she hadn't spoken a single word since. Across the aisle, the man accused of taking her sat calm, almost smug, certain her silence would protect him. But what none of them saw coming was what the dog would do next. If you're still with us, like, subscribe, and stay. This story is just beginning. The rain had stopped just an hour earlier, leaving the sidewalks of downtown Ashbury slick with glistening puddles. It was a chilly morning in early October, and a thin veil of mist curled around the courthouse steps like a reluctant breath. The air was heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and pine from the nearby hills, while a few maple leaves, rusted with the red and gold of fall, stuck to the concrete like forgotten memories. Inside the courthouse, the lighting was dim and serious, casting long shadows from the high wooden panels and old brass fixtures. The ceiling fan creaked in a slow rotation, as if echoing the tension of the day. In this solemn space, every breath felt louder, every movement measured. At precisely 9:01 a.m., the heavy oak doors at the back of Courtroom B creaked open. A hush fell instantly over the gallery. A small girl entered. Lila Thompson, 6 years old, pale-skinned and slender as a reed, stood in the threshold clutching the braided fabric of a thick leash. Her light blonde hair was pulled back into a low, uneven ponytail, and the sleeves of her knitted blue sweater stretched down past her wrists as if she were trying to disappear into them. Her green eyes scanned the room, not with fear, but a quiet solemnity, the kind one does not expect from someone so young. Since the day of the incident 3 months ago, she had not spoken a single word. Beside her walked Scout, a 4-year-old male German shepherd with a coat of deep black and warm tan, his strong frame silent and composed. A thin scar curved down his left shoulder, a jagged remnant of his last day as a search and rescue K-9 in Portland's urban disaster unit. During a collapsed bridge incident, Scout had pulled 2 survivors out before being struck by a falling beam. The injury ended his career in the force, but earned him quiet respect among handlers and a place in a trauma recovery program for children. Scout walked with practiced grace, ears perked, movements patient, his amber eyes scanning every face in the courtroom without breaking stride. Unlike other dogs, he never strained against the leash, never broke formation. He didn't need to. His presence alone was grounding a wall of protection without threat. In the second row of the gallery, Sarah Thompson, Lila's mother, leaned forward as her daughter entered. Sarah, in her late 30s, was a tall woman with soft features now sharpened by months of worry. Her shoulder-length chestnut hair was pinned back, and her posture had the rigid grace of someone trying not to break in public. A former elementary school teacher, Sarah had once been known in Ashbury for her warmth and creativity, always organizing community bake sales or leading story time at the local library. But since the incident, her world had narrowed to her daughter's silence, and her smiles came slowly now, if at all. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced, his baritone voice reverberating through the chamber. All rise. Judge Thomas Miller, a man of firm bearing and white brows, descended into his seat with a slow nod. In his early 60s, Judge Miller had served on the Ashbury bench for over 3 decades. He was known for his fairness, but also for the sharp intuition behind his pale blue eyes, a gift shaped by a lifetime of watching lies fall apart in front of him. He leaned slightly forward as Lila and Scout took their place at the front. Across the room, the defendant sat with a carefully composed expression. John Ramsey, a 47-year-old software engineer with a receding hairline and well-ironed khakis, looked unremarkable in every way. That, Sarah once noted bitterly, was part of what made it worse. He didn't look like a predator. He looked like someone's dad, someone who shouldn't have been anywhere near her daughter. Arrested based on an eyewitness placing him near the scene, John had remained calm throughout the pre-trial hearings. He rarely blinked, and even now, he sat at the defense table with his hands folded, his gray eyes glancing briefly at Lila, then at the dog. Lila took her seat at the witness box, legs swinging slightly above the ground. She said nothing. She never did, not anymore. But her right hand, small and pale, slowly moved in a way only two beings in that room noticed. Her fingers made a small motion, subtle and deliberate. It was a hand signal one she had practiced quietly during therapy sessions. It meant, help. Scout's reaction was immediate. The German shepherd stiffened, his ears snapped upright, and a low rumble formed deep in his throat. Not loud, but ancient, primal. His body shifted, muscles taut like bowstrings. His gaze locked onto John Ramsey with such fierce intensity that several members of the jury turned. The tension rippled out across the room like a silent alarm. John's lips twitched, just barely. The room went deathly still. Even Judge Miller sat straighter. His hand hovered near the gavel, but didn't strike yet. Scout didn't move toward Ramsey. He didn't bark. But the growl in his chest deepened slightly, as if confirming something he already knew. Judge Miller's voice sliced the silence like glass. This court will take a 15-minute recess. The gavel slammed down hard once. It echoed through the air like a warning shot. The bailiff stepped forward, murmuring instructions to clear the room. Sarah rose quickly from the gallery, eyes locked on her daughter. She wanted to run to Lila, to hold her, but she paused. Lila was still seated, one hand buried in Scout's fur. Scout didn't take his eyes off John Ramsey. Judge Miller didn't move. He stayed seated long after the courtroom emptied. Something had just happened. Something he couldn't explain. Not yet. But after all his years in courtrooms, he had never seen a support animal react that way. Not to a gesture, not with that certainty. The girl hadn't said a word. But the dog had spoken volumes. Ashbury, a quiet town nestled at the edge of the Oregon Cascades, wore the light of early June like a secret it didn't want to share. The sky was a flawless stretch of blue, endless and serene, with the kind of sunlight that poured like warm honey over rooftops and sidewalks. The rain from the night before had left the air sweet and heavy with the scent of damp pine, blooming lilacs, and freshly turned earth. Maple leaves and early blush drifted lazily across driveways. A red squirrel darted along a picket fence, pausing only to chatter at the breeze as it stirred the treetops with gentle insistence. It was the kind of day that made you forget that anything bad could ever happen, because in Ashbury, nothing ever did. But sometimes, fate chooses the most peaceful afternoons to break something fragile. In the backyard of a modest white house at the end of a cul-de-sac, 6-year-old Lila Thompson danced barefoot in the grass. Her pink cotton dress billowed with every spin, a soft blur against the green lawn. She was a quiet, imaginative child, more observer than talker, who often spent hours building kingdoms from stones and narrating stories to passing butterflies. Her small world was a safe one, filled with the quiet magic of her own making, until the moment that world cracked. Inside the house, Sarah Thompson, Lila's mother, stood at the kitchen window with a cup of chamomile tea cooling beside her. She was a tall woman in her late 30s with graceful posture, remnants of a ballet past that still lived in the way she moved. Her chestnut hair was gathered in a long braid, a few strands loose around a tired but kind face. Sarah had once been the warm, open-hearted teacher that children adored and parents trusted. But a miscarriage 2 years earlier, followed by a move away from her support system, had left shadows beneath her eyes. Lila was her light now, the center of everything. Sarah smiled as she watched her daughter twirl, sunlight catching in her hair. Her phone buzzed beside her on the counter. A call from Maddie, her older sister in Phoenix. Still watching Lila through the glass, she picked up. "Hey Maddie, we're good. Lila's just out dancing again. Hang on, let me see if she wants to say hi." She turned back to the window, her voice caught mid-breath. The backyard gate was open. It had been latched, and Lila was no longer dancing. She stood frozen near the open gate, her back to the house, shoulders stiff. Parked at the curb was a black van. The side door was slid halfway open. A man crouched beside her, just beyond the garden's edge. He was holding something in his hands, speaking softly. Too softly for Sarah to hear, but his posture relaxed, calculated screamed familiarity. Something primal in Sarah took over. She dropped the phone, bolted through the kitchen, and burst out the door. "Lila!" The man's head jerked up. He looked average in every way. Short brown hair, pale complexion, wire-rimmed glasses. The kind of man you'd forget after standing next to him in line. But in that moment, his expression shifted, pleasantness melting into something razor-sharp. He reached out and grabbed Lila's arm. Lila didn't scream. She didn't move. She stared at him, silent and still. Across the street, Mrs. Diane Whittaker, a retired nurse in her 70s with a bright blue windbreaker and a beagle named Percy, had been watching from her daily walk. She may have been small in stature, but decades in emergency rooms had given her a voice that could cut through panic. "Hey!" she shouted, stomping her cane against the sidewalk. "Get away from that child!" The man hesitated. It was enough. Lila pulled her arm free and ran straight into her mother's arms. Sarah caught her, cradling her against her chest just as the van's engine roared. It peeled away with a screech, tires leaving thick black streaks on the pavement. Sarah collapsed to the ground, holding her daughter so tightly it was as if she could shield her from the memory itself. But Lila didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She only trembled. The first responders were on the scene within minutes. Neighbors emerged from porches, voices overlapping in alarm and disbelief. Within the hour, an unmarked FBI vehicle pulled up quietly along the curb. From it stepped Detective Frank O'Neill, a man in his mid-50s with iron-gray hair, worn boots, and the expression of someone who had stopped believing in coincidence a long time ago. His face was weathered and sharp, his voice low and deliberate. "This fits the pattern," he said to his partner, scanning the street. "Public place, black van, bait the kid with something puppies, candy, doesn't matter." His partner, Agent Marissa Glenn, in her 30s with dark hair tied back and eyes as precise as a scalpel, crouched next to Lila on the porch step. "Hi, sweetheart," she said gently, kneeling to her level. "Do you remember anything about the man? What he looked like?" Lila said nothing. She held tightly to her mother's arm, face blank. "She hasn't said a word since it happened," Sarah whispered, barely audible. "Not one." O'Neill scribbled into a leather-bound notebook. "That's the fourth in 18 months. Same region, same setup, different girl." Just then, Diane Whittaker spoke again, stepping forward from the crowd. "I got a partial plate," she said firmly. "First three letters YKZ. O'Neill nodded. "That helps." But even as information was gathered, even as search alerts were drafted and license databases were combed, one thing was certain. Lila Thompson was no longer the child she had been. In the days that followed, she withdrew completely. She stopped playing, stopped drawing, refused to leave the house. She slept with the lights on, and even then, the nightmares came. She thrashed silently in bed, her lips parted in terror, but no scream ever came. Only gasps, choked and tiny, that woke her parents in the middle of the night, helpless. They tried everything. Favorite bedtime stories, mac and cheese with cut-up hot dogs, her stuffed rabbit named Willow. Nothing broke through. Then, one night, Sarah sat across from her husband, Daniel Thompson, a gentle man with sandy blonde hair and eyes that always looked for solutions. He had been a school counselor before, becoming a full-time stay-at-home dad after Lila was born. Now, his calm exterior barely masked the storm brewing beneath. "The therapist suggested a support animal," Sarah said quietly, fingers wrapped tightly around her mug. "Maybe a dog." Daniel hesitated. "Will it help?" "I don't know, but I'll try anything." They didn't know it yet, but someone was waiting, someone who didn't need words to listen. Someone who had once pulled survivors from the wreckage of a collapsed bridge, and who, despite a scar running down his shoulder, still knew how to find what was lost. His name was Scout, and he was about to meet the girl who had forgotten how to speak. The lobby of the Pine Brook Animal Recovery Center smelled faintly of lavender, with a deeper undertone of antiseptic and something warm and earthy fur perhaps, or the residual scent of wet paws from a morning grooming session. On the far wall hung framed photos of animals with their human companions, smiling children with golden retrievers, veterans hugging Labrador mixes, a teen girl in a wheelchair whose lap was occupied by a beaming therapy spaniel. The center didn't feel like a clinic. It felt like a waiting room for hope. Sarah Thompson sat rigid in one of the vinyl armchairs, her legs crossed tight, fingers folded in a nervous tangle in her lap. She wore dark jeans and a soft forest green sweater, and though her clothes were neat, there was an exhausted sag in her posture that betrayed weeks of sleep lost to worry. Her eyes scanned the room walls painted in gentle pastels, a low bookshelf with dog-themed children's books, a nearby table with a plastic jar of sugar-free mints. She looked at everything except her daughter. Lila sat across from her, curled in the corner of a padded bench, knees drawn to her chest. She wore a pale gray hoodie with a little embroidered rabbit on the sleeve. Her blonde hair was pulled into a low-side ponytail, slightly askew from the car ride. She hadn't spoken since that terrible day, and worse, she barely reacted. The once vibrant child who narrated her stuffed animal's adventures now moved like a ghost in her own skin. The door to the back hallway opened with a gentle click. A woman stepped out. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Dr. Laurel Bennett," she said, her voice soft but assured. "We spoke on the phone." Dr. Bennett was in her mid-40s, with copper-brown hair tied back into a loose bun, wire-frame glasses, and a warm smile that had clearly been trained for fragile moments. She wore a navy blouse under a khaki vest with a stitched logo that read, "Pinebrook Animal Recovery Center, Healing in Pairs." Her presence was calm, grounded-like, the kind of person who wouldn't flinch if a child cried or a dog bolted. Sarah stood quickly, brushing non-existent lint from her jeans. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice," she said, her voice lined with both gratitude and urgency. "Lila, she hasn't spoken since, well, you have the report." Dr. Bennett nodded gently. "I did, and I think we can take things one small step at a time." She turned to Lila, lowering herself slightly to the child's eye level. "Hi, Lila. You don't have to say anything. You don't even have to look at me if you don't want to. But I'd love for you to meet someone special." She gestured toward the doorway behind her. From the hallway, a large German shepherd stepped quietly into the room. He moved with slow, deliberate grace, not the bouncy eagerness of a pet, but the silent control of an animal trained to read the energy of a space. His coat was a rich blend of sable and black, and a pale, jagged scar ran down his left shoulder. His ears stood tall but not stiff, and his amber eyes settled on Lila with something that looked startlingly close to curiosity. "This," said Dr. Bennett, "is Scout." Scout stood still, just inside the doorway, head slightly tilted. He didn't rush forward or wag. He simply waited. Lila lifted her eyes. She said nothing, of course, but for the first time in days, weeks, she focused on something with intention. Her gaze locked on Scout's scar, then on his eyes. She didn't move, but neither did she shrink away. "He's not like other dogs," Dr. Bennett said gently. 3 years ago, he saved a boy during a building collapse, pinned under concrete, and no one else could reach him. Scout crawled in and lay with him until the rescue team could dig them both out. He got hurt that day, pretty badly, couldn't go back into the field, but he still wanted to help. Sarah swallowed hard. "They retired him?" "They scheduled him for euthanasia," Bennett said plainly, as if the word were just a fact. "But I pulled every string I could to bring him here. Some dogs stop working when they're injured. Others just find a new way to serve." Lila's shoulders tensed, then eased. Scout took one step forward, then another. Still no bark, no whine. Just soft paw pads on tile. He stopped 3 feet from Lila's bench and sat. Waited. "Would you like to say hi?" Dr. Bennett asked, looking at Lila, but not pressing her. Sarah barely breathed. Lila's hand, still curled around the sleeve of her hoodie, trembled. For a moment, she looked like she might bolt, but instead, she uncurled her fingers slowly, as though releasing something heavy. Her hand hovered in the air, uncertain, then lowered, and extended toward the dog. Scout remained motionless. Lila's hand touched his fur. It was the lightest contact, a few fingers brushing across the thick sable coat, but it might as well have been a scream. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes already welling. Scout blinked once. Then very slowly, he lowered his head and nudged her palm. The touch wasn't forceful. It wasn't even expectant. It was mutual. Dr. Bennett smiled, not at the dog, not at Lila, but at the fragile connection forming like a thread between them. "You don't have to talk," she said gently. "You don't even have to stay long, but Scout will be here, anytime you want." Lila didn't reply. She didn't need to. She sat still, her hand now resting fully on Scout's shoulder. She leaned forward, just slightly, enough for her forehead to almost touch his head. She closed her eyes. And in that moment, for the first time in weeks, she looked like a child again. By the end of that first week, the rhythm of the Thompson household had subtly shifted. There were still silences, yes, but they were no longer hollow. Scout's quiet paws could be heard padding across the hardwood floor, a gentle, grounding presence weaving himself into the corners of a house once filled with echoes. Lila didn't speak, not to her parents, not to her therapist. But she had begun to communicate in her own way, and Scout listened. He followed her without being told. When she sat on the front porch steps in the late afternoon light, knees pulled to her chest, Scout would settle beside her with a sigh, his body curved protectively along her side. When she woke from her nightmares, silent but thrashing, he would nose open her door and climb into bed, resting his head across her legs until she calmed. Lila's sketchbook, untouched for weeks, now lay open on the living room coffee table. The first drawings were simple and tentative. A stick figure girl, a dog with pointy ears, a house with 3 windows and a yellow sun. But over time, the lines became bolder, more purposeful. One afternoon, Sarah found a page with a black rectangle in the background, clearly a van hovering behind the girl and the dog. The next day's drawing showed a tall, faceless figure reaching out toward the child, while the dog stood between them, growling. She didn't ask about it. She just gently kissed the top of her daughter's head and whispered, "Thank you for showing us." Scout seemed to understand these drawings too. He often rested his chin on the table while Lila worked, watching her crayon-streaked fingers as if memorizing each movement. His tail would occasionally give a single thump when she paused to glance at him. Sarah, watching all of this, began to breathe differently. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that felt like hope. That Saturday, they returned to Pine Brook for their second visit. Lila held Scout's leash as they entered, still silent, but now with her shoulders a little higher and her steps a little less hesitant. Dr. Laurel Bennett met them at the door with a warm smile and led them down the hall to the training room, a wide space with padded floors, ramps, and soft hurdles. "We're going to do a few simple tasks today," Laurel explained, her voice calm and clear. "Nothing demanding, just something that helps Lila and Scout practice working together." The room was already occupied by another woman, Maya Tran, one of the center's senior dog handlers. She was in her early 30s with short black curls and an athletic build, dressed in cargo pants and a slate gray Pine Brook t-shirt. Maya didn't speak much, but there was a quiet confidence in the way she moved and an almost instinctive gentleness around animals. She gave Scout a respectful nod and offered Lila a smile that didn't ask for anything in return. The first activity involved a simple find command. Scout had to sniff out a toy hidden beneath one of 3 traffic cones placed on the floor. Maya demonstrated with her own shepherd, a lean, white-coated female named Echo, who trotted confidently across the room and pawed the correct cone. Then it was Lila's turn. She hesitated at first. Her hand tightened around the leash. She looked at Scout, then at the cones, then back at Scout again. Slowly, without looking at the adults, she pointed to the middle cone. Scout looked at her, tail twitching, then trotted forward, nose low to the ground. He paused, circled, then returned to the middle cone and sat beside it. Lila's lips parted, just slightly. Sarah leaned forward, holding her breath. Dr. Bennett watched with the patience of someone who had seen small miracles unfold before. Scout nudged the cone, revealing a soft blue tug toy beneath it. And then, like a leaf falling in slow motion, the words came. "Good boy," Lila whispered. It was barely audible, just 2 words, fragile, unsure, but it was her voice. Sarah's eyes welled instantly. She didn't cry out. She didn't rush to embrace her daughter. She simply folded her hands in her lap, pressed them to her lips, and allowed the tears to fall quietly. Daniel, standing just inside the doorway, turned away slightly, blinking fast. Laurel gave a tiny nod. "That's more than enough for today," she said gently, her voice softer than the moment deserved. Afterward, they sat in the small family room near the exit. Scout lay at Lila's feet, his head resting against her sneakers. She sketched silently while her parents filled out follow-up paperwork. On her page was a new drawing, a girl, a dog, and a single speech bubble above her head with the words, "Good boy." Later that evening, back at home, Sarah placed the drawing on the refrigerator door with a magnet shaped like a paw print. She didn't speak either, but the smile on her face was the first real one in months. The morning of the pretrial hearing dawned overcast and brittle, as though the clouds themselves held their breath. Rain had passed through Ashbury in the night, leaving a sheen of water on the courthouse steps and the soft scent of damp stone clinging to the air. A few news vans idled at the curb, their antennas raised like cautious ears, while camera crews stood shivering in light jackets, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. Inside courtroom 2A, The atmosphere was thick with tension. Wooden benches creaked under the shifting weight of reporters, families, and quiet spectators. At the front of the room sat Judge Thomas H. Miller, his silver hair combed precisely, his gaze cool behind rimless glasses. Known for his thoroughness and razor-sharp intuition, Miller had built his reputation on never overlooking the small things, especially the things that didn't speak. The bailiff called the room to order, and the defense attorney Rose Edward Blaine, a tall man with perfectly parted dark hair and an expensive navy suit, who specialized in difficult clients. His manner was smooth, almost uncomfortably so, and he always wore cufflinks. Blaine's client John Ramsey sat beside him, shoulders square, lips drawn in a calm line. Ramsey wore a charcoal gray blazer and beige slacks, his expression unreadable, his movements minimal. He kept his eyes forward, save for one glance toward the doors when they opened. And then Lila entered. The little girl's arrival made no sound, only the soft pad of footsteps and the quiet jingle of a leash. 6 years old, still as delicate as a willow branch, Lila walked beside Scout with a composure that didn't belong to a child. She wore a simple navy dress, tights, and a light wool cardigan buttoned unevenly. In her left hand, she held the leash. In her right, clutched close to her chest, was her sketchbook. Behind her walked her mother, Sarah, dressed in a slate-gray coat and soft-heeled shoes, her hair swept back in a bun. Her face was pale but composed, her lips pressed together in a quiet line of determination. Sarah had spent the entire night rehearsing how to keep herself from running to Lila mid-trial. She had succeeded so far. Scout walked with the same measured stride he always did. The 4-year-old German shepherd, lean and powerful, had been bathed the night before, his fur brushed until it shone like brushed bronze beneath the courtroom lights. The pale scar on his left shoulder, normally hidden beneath harnesses or fur, was now plainly visible. No one had tried to cover it. He bore it like a badge. Judge Miller's gaze flicked toward the dog, then to the girl, then back again. He didn't say anything, but his hand paused for half a beat before flipping through his notes. When Lila was seated beside her court-appointed counselor, Ms. Ray Fisher, a kindly middle-aged woman with graying curls and a soft Vermont accent, Scout sat beside her, leaning just slightly into her shin. Not a word passed between them. It didn't have to. Prosecutor Denise Caldwell, a compact, sharp-featured woman in her early 40s with a clipped tone and a reputation for being relentless, stepped forward. She adjusted the microphone. Your Honor, the state requests acknowledgement of the witness's therapy dog as a vital presence to her participation in these proceedings. Blaine stood before the judge could nod. We don't question the child's need for comfort, Your Honor, but I must note that the presence of a large dog may unduly influence the jury. A dog that growls or reacts emotionally could sway opinion. Judge Miller didn't blink. The jury isn't present for this pretrial, Mr. Blaine. You may proceed, Ms. Caldwell. Denise continued. We ask that the court allow the child to respond in nonverbal means, gestures, drawings, or signals developed during therapy, should verbal testimony not be forthcoming. Permission was granted. Then, a brief silence. Caldwell knelt beside Lila and gently opened her sketchbook to a marked page. It contained a familiar drawing, a girl standing behind a dog facing down a tall man. Lila, she said softly, is this what happened that day? Lila nodded, her fingers tightening around the crayon she had insisted on bringing. Then she did something she hadn't done before, not in practice, not in therapy. She pointed. Her finger, small and trembling but sure, extended across the courtroom to John Ramsey. Scout moved. It was not dramatic. He didn't bark, didn't lunge, didn't even growl, but every muscle in his body snapped to attention. Ears forward, body rigid, eyes locked onto Ramsey with such unwavering intensity that half the courtroom turned to look. And then, a sound low, rumbling, the kind of primal warning only animals can give. A growl that built from somewhere deep in Scout's chest, controlled, contained, but unmistakable. Ramsey flinched, just barely. But Judge Miller saw it. So did someone else. Detective Frank O'Neill, seated in the gallery, had been watching the proceedings with folded arms. Now, in his early 60s, Frank had the build of a man who still ran stairs out of habit, though his hair had thinned and silvered with time. He was quiet, observant, with a gaze like wet gravel hard, steady and unshaken. The growl made him sit up straighter. He leaned toward the prosecutor's table and whispered something to Caldwell, who nodded once, then addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we request a recess. There may be new grounds for investigation based on this reaction." Blaine scoffed audibly. "A dog's reaction isn't evidence, Your Honor." But Judge Miller held up a hand. "And yet, Mr. Blaine, I've seen human witnesses with less certainty in their testimony." He turned toward O'Neill. "Detective, if you believe this warrants review, make your submission by end of day. We'll resume in the morning." Gavel down. Recess called. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah gently took Lila's hand, but the girl was still looking at Scout. He had relaxed now, but his eyes never left the spot where Ramsey had sat. Outside in the corridor, O'Neill tapped out a message on his phone and made a call. "Start pulling every piece of contact Ramsey's had with local facilities, vet clinics, dog parks, anywhere a dog like Scout might have crossed his path. I want to know if this is a recognition or just instinct." Inside, Judge Miller remained seated, staring down at the transcript before him. He circled one line. "Scout's body language reflects identification." And beneath it, he wrote in the margin, "Not trained, not prompted, not accidental." The wind that swept across the northern ridge of Ashbury carried the crisp bite of early winter. By the time the sun crested the tree line, Detective Frank O'Neill was already standing on the gravel access road that led deep into the forest. He wore a navy field jacket zipped up to the neck, his badge clipped to his belt, and a thermos of coffee in one hand. Despite his 61 years, Frank still had the square frame and deliberate movements of a man used to early mornings and colder truths. His eyes, pale gray under a furrowed brow, studied the treetops as if they might whisper a secret. Beside him stood Deputy Carla Jennings, a newer addition to the Ashbury County Sheriff's Office. Carla was in her early 30s, with auburn hair tied into a practical braid and a sharp, analytical demeanor that belied her calm exterior. Her khaki uniform was neatly pressed, and her notepad was already filled with timestamps and notes. She was the kind of officer who asked quiet questions and let people underestimate her. That usually worked to her advantage. The lead had come from a soil sample. After Scout's reaction in the courtroom, O'Neill had requested the old van, previously impounded during Ramsey's initial arrest, be re-examined. Forensics had pulled a sample from under the wheel well, pine-heavy topsoil mixed with decaying spruce needles and traces of rust. That specific combination pointed toward a patch of forest 20 miles north of town, near an abandoned ranger outpost long since decommissioned. "We've got the drone footage coming in," Carla said, glancing at her tablet. "No signs of recent foot traffic, but thermal picked up a residual heat signature near the back of the structure. Could be an animal, could be nothing." O'Neill nodded. "Or it could be what this whole thing's been circling around." The SUV that pulled up next wasn't marked. Out stepped Dr. Laurel Bennett, her khaki vest zipped to her chin and a leash already in her hand. Scout leapt out behind her, landing softly on the gravel and immediately raising his nose to the air. His muscles tensed almost instantly. "I've never seen him like this," Laurel said quietly, wrapping her gloves around the leash tighter. "He picked up something the moment we passed the highway turnoff." Scout pulled slightly, not in agitation, but in intent. His nose was low, tail stiff, body poised like a wire about to snap. O'Neill looked at him, then gave a nod. "Let's follow him." The path that led through the trees was overgrown but visible, a faint trail of moss and damp leaves leading deeper into the woods. Scout led without hesitation, paws landing with deliberate quiet, weaving past roots and boulders like he knew the way by memory. Laurel jogged behind him, her breath short but even. The group crested a low rise, and there it was. A cabin. Weather-beaten, shingled roof half collapsed, with shutters hanging askew like broken wings. It sat in the crook of a clearing, trees looming around it like sentinels. A rusted oil drum leaned near the porch, and old footprints faint but present dotted the perimeter. The door itself was closed but unlocked. O'Neill pushed it open. The interior was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and wrong. Dust floated through the beam of O'Neill's flashlight like ash. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A table, 2 chairs, a cracked window covered with plastic, and in one corner, a cot with a threadbare blanket. "Nothing up here," Carla said, sweeping her beam along the walls. "But the temperature's wrong. Too cold for a structure this small." Scout, who had been circling the edges of the room, suddenly froze. His head snapped toward the far wall. He let out a low whine, then scratched once at the floorboards near a pile of firewood. O'Neill moved quickly, pushing aside the woodpile. Beneath it, half covered in pine dust, was a trap door. He crouched, pried it open. The smell hit them first, damp earth, rust, and the faintest trace of human sweat. The narrow staircase led into a basement space not listed in any property record. The walls were concrete, the air thick with moisture. A bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow light. In the far corner, chained to a support beam by the ankle, was a child. A girl. She was curled on a thin mattress, no older than 9, her frame small and hollow from hunger. Her clothes were torn and mismatched, her hair matted. But when the light hit her eyes, she turned, slowly, cautiously. Carla was the first to speak. "Emma?" The girl didn't reply, but her eyes widened in recognition. O'Neill stepped forward, lowering his flashlight. "You're safe," he said. "We're here to take you home." Emma Sullivan, missing for 6 months. Posters had long since faded, and the leads had dried up. But now, against every prediction, she was alive. Laurel crouched beside Scout, who was trembling, not in fear, but urgency. The shepherd strained toward the girl, whining softly. O'Neill knelt beside Emma and unhooked the ankle shackle with a bolt cutter from his belt. The girl didn't scream, she didn't speak, but she clutched his wrist with thin fingers and didn't let go. Back on the surface, paramedics were already pulling up the trail. Carla radioed for immediate evacuation, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging under her skin. As they brought Emma up from the basement, Scout walked beside her without needing a command. The girl's hand, tiny and pale, found its way to his back as if by instinct. He didn't move, just matched her pace. O'Neill turned toward Laurel. "We need to run DNA from the mattress, the chain, the interior of that van. Cross-reference everything with Ramsey?" Laurel's lips were tight, jaw clenched. "You think he brought her here?" "I don't think anymore," O'Neill said. "I know." The courtroom was no longer just a room. It had become a pressure chamber one, where each person's breath felt borrowed, each whisper capable of igniting something irreversible. The gallery was packed, the hushed murmurs of reporters, townsfolk, and court personnel giving way to thick silence as the bailiff called the room to order. Sunlight filtered in through tall, dust-flecked windows, warming the wooden benches but doing nothing to ease the tension in the air. Judge Thomas Miller sat taller than usual, his gavel resting quietly at the edge of the bench. He wore his fatigue carefully, hidden beneath a crisp black robe and the steady command of a man who had seen trials fracture families, destroy reputations, and occasionally restore something lost. Today felt like the kind of day that might hold all three. At the prosecution table, Denise Caldwell flipped through a folder of freshly printed documents, DNA reports, photos from the hidden basement, a copy of Emma Sullivan's hospital intake form. Her jaw was tight, and the highlighter tucked behind her ear quivered every time her hand moved. Beside her sat Detective Frank O'Neill, arms crossed, his brow low and hard as granite. He had spent the past 2 nights compiling a 30-page supplemental file, every line written with the clarity and finality of someone who was done chasing shadows. Across the aisle, Edward Blaine, defense counsel, wore the look of a man on a sinking ship who still hoped the orchestra might distract the crowd. He adjusted his tie more than once in the first 5 minutes. Sitting beside him, John Ramsey looked smaller than usual. His normally pressed blazer sat awkwardly on his shoulders, and a fine sheen of sweat had begun to creep along his hairline. His left hand, previously so still, now tapped lightly against the table's edge. Then the doors opened. Sarah Thompson walked in first, dressed in navy slacks and a white blouse, her dark hair pinned back in a twist. She held Lila's hand gently, but not guiding. It was more like the two moved as a single synchronized unit. Lila, in a deep maroon dress with a matching ribbon at her waist, clutched her sketchbook in one arm and Scout's leash in the other. She looked straight ahead, her lips pressed in a line of quiet courage. Scout, freshly brushed and focused as ever, trotted beside her. His gait was calm, but there was a distinct alertness in the way his ears flicked at every sound, every footstep. His eyes scanned the room, not with curiosity, but purpose. He knew this room. He remembered what happened here. "Please be seated," Judge Miller said, tapping the gavel once. Denise stood. "Your Honor, the prosecution moves to introduce new testimonial evidence and forensic links in light of the recovery of Emma Sullivan. With your permission, we'd like to begin with her statement." Judge Miller nodded, but his eyes moved to Lila and Scout. "Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the court's youngest participant and her support animal. Miss Thompson, you and Scout may remain seated or come forward, whichever makes you more comfortable." Lila didn't answer, but she didn't need to. She stood, gently nudging Scout's shoulder, and walked to the witness seat. Scout followed with precision, settling beside her as she sat and opened her sketchbook to a specific page. It was the one she'd drawn after the cabin raid. Emma and Scout at the edge of the basement stairs, light spilling upward behind them. Denise stepped forward. "Lila, I know you don't have to say anything, but if you feel ready, you can tell us what you remember, or show us." Lila looked up briefly. Then she did something no one expected. She spoke. "His voice," she said quietly. It was the same voice. Gasps rippled through the room. Blaine stood sharply. "Objection. This child has been nonverbal for weeks and—" Judge Miller raised a hand. "She's speaking now. I will hear her." Lila turned her eyes to Ramsey. "I remember his smile," she added, voice trembling but audible. "It didn't look like a smile when I got close." Her hand reached down. Scout, as if on cue, rose to his feet. Slowly he walked 3 paces forward until he stood in the open space between the witness box and the defense table. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stared, unblinking, unmoving, every muscle in his body taut. John Ramsey's composure cracked. He looked away once, then back. His tapping hand stilled. The sweat along his brow thickened. Judge Miller spoke, voice calm but direct. "Mr. Ramsey, do you recognize this dog?" Ramsey swallowed hard. "No," he muttered. "Have you ever interacted with him?" I don't think so." But then Lila rose from her chair and pointed not to Scout, not to the sketchbook, but directly at Ramsey. "He took Emma," she said, "and he almost took me." Denise's voice, usually sharp, softened. "Your Honor, we request permission to enter the new DNA report. The sample taken from the chain in the basement matches Mr. Ramsey. Additionally, partial fingerprints on the lock mechanism match his left thumb." Judge Miller leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Blaine?" Blaine looked at his client, whose eyes were now wide, blinking rapidly. "I need a moment with my client," he said. Judge Miller nodded. 10 minutes. The courtroom cleared with a nervous rustle of movement, people stepping into the hall in stunned silence. 10 minutes became 12, then 15. When everyone returned, John Ramsey's eyes were glassy. His hands shook as he stood. "Your Honor," he said hoarsely, "I would like to change my plea." A silence louder than thunder settled over the room. "Guilty," he whispered. Sarah closed her eyes. O'Neill exhaled, deep and controlled. Denise set her folder down, hands trembling slightly. "And Lila?" She leaned forward, wrapped her arms around Scout's neck, and whispered, "We did it." Scout wagged his tail once slow, steady, and rested his chin on her knee. The early spring light drifted gently over the hills of Pine Brook, softening the edges of the therapy center's shingled roof and throwing gentle gold across the dewy grass. It was the kind of morning that felt earned arriving after a long, bruised winter. Not with grand gestures, but in small acts of warmth. Daffodils peeked out along the walking path, birdsong threaded through the breeze, and inside the center, the air was laced with the familiar mix of brewed tea and dog shampoo. Scout lay on his favorite mat in the corner of the sunroom, his head resting on one paw, ears twitching now and then toward the sound of squirrels scampering beyond the windows. He was calmer these days. His eyes still carried the sharp attentiveness of a working dog, but they softened quickly whenever Lila entered a room, as if some quiet contract had been fulfilled, and now his only duty was to stay nearby. Dr. Laurel Bennett stood near the window, holding a clipboard in one hand and a ceramic mug in the other. Her copper hair was tucked behind her ears, and today she wore her usual khaki vest over a maroon sweater with frayed cuffs. She watched Scout as she sipped her tea, allowing herself a rare smile. "You've done something bigger than most humans ever will," she murmured to him. Scout blinked at her slowly, as if to say, "I know." Moments later, the door opened. Lila stepped inside, her steps light but sure. Her hair was now trimmed to shoulder length, a soft chestnut gold that framed her face. She wore denim overalls and a yellow t-shirt with little white stars along the sleeves. In her arms was her sketchbook creased, well-worn, and filled now to its final pages. Behind her, Sarah lingered in the doorway. The months had changed her too. Her frame was still slim, still graceful, but her eyes had relaxed. There were lines at the corners of her mouth that hadn't been there before, smile lines. She wore a loose cardigan and jeans, and her posture had shed the tight coil of worry she used to carry like armor. Now she simply looked like a mother watching her child take the lead. Lila walked to Scout and sat down cross-legged on the mat beside him. He raised his head, tail tapping once on the floor. She reached forward, placed a hand gently against the fur on his chest, and leaned closer. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not leaving." Scout leaned into her hand. She continued, her voice no longer a thread of wind, but something that carried, "For staying when I didn't know how to ask you to." Dr. Bennett turned slightly, giving them space. Lila opened her sketchbook to the final page. On it, in bold crayon strokes she had drawn herself and Scout, sitting at the base of a tree, her hand on his head, his eyes watchful. Behind them were the faint outlines of two shadows, one tall, one small, fading into the distance. The words scrawled at the bottom read, "I am not afraid anymore." That evening, back at home, the Thompsons prepared dinner with music playing in the background. Lila danced between the kitchen island and the fridge, humming along to a song she used to sing before everything changed. Daniel stood at the stove, flipping grilled cheese sandwiches with theatrical flair, while Sarah chopped strawberries with the ease of someone reclaiming routine. There was no ceremony to the meal, just clinking forks, laughter, and the occasional bark when Scout smelled food and gently protested being excluded. After dinner, Lila sat in her room with her sketchbook in her lap, and Scout curled beside her on the rug. She turned the pages slowly, reviewing the journey she had lived in, color and lines. The dark van, the courtroom, the cabin, the girl with a scar on her ankle, the boy with a badge, and finally, the page that mattered most, the one where she had drawn a single word in the speech bubble, "Speak." Later, Sarah tucked her in. "Did you want to tell Scout goodnight?" she asked gently. Lila nodded, rolled to her side, and wrapped an arm around Scout's neck. "Good night, hero," she said, pressing her forehead to his. "You're my brave dog." Scout didn't wag, didn't move. He simply stayed with her until her breathing slowed into sleep. In the weeks that followed, Scout returned to the center with Dr. Bennett for a few hours each day, easing back into his therapy role, but he always came home to Lila at night. They were partners now, in a way words rarely captured. Scout had become more than her protector. He had become her memory keeper, her quiet reassurance, her bridge back to herself. Sarah and Daniel continued therapy sessions as a family. Lila began talking more, sometimes in full bursts, sometimes in whispers. She asked questions again, drew pictures of things that had never happened, like castles and mermaids and pancakes with legs. Scout featured in all of them. At school, Lila brought her sketchbook during show and tell. When it was her turn, she stood at the front of the classroom, Scout sitting calmly at her side in his therapy vest, and held up her favorite drawing, the one where Scout stood between her and the man in the shadows. "This is my dog," she said aloud. "He helped me find my voice." And every child in that room, whether they understood what she meant or not, sat quietly listening. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth. And sometimes God sends us angels not with wings, but with 4 paws and a quiet heart. In a world that can be loud and cruel, this story reminds us that healing is possible, love is real, and miracles still happen. If this touched your heart, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. And if you believe that every child deserves to be heard and protected, type Amen in the comments. May God bless and protect you always.